The dust swirled around Margaret's worn leather boots as she stepped down from the wagon. Her hands trembling not from the cold October wind, but from the weight of what she was about to face. The auctioneer's voice carried across the town square of Cedar Ridge like a death knell, calling out lot numbers and prices for livestock, farm equipment, and human souls alike. She pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders, trying to shield herself from the stares of the gathered crowd who had come to witness her humiliation. Lot 17. The auctioneer bellowed, his voice cutting through the autumn air. One widow woman, age 28, good health, capable of household duties. Bidding starts at $50. Margaret's cheeks burned with shame as hands shot up around the square. She had never imagined her life would come to this, standing on a wooden platform like a piece of property to be sold to the highest bidder. Just 6 months ago, she had been Mrs. Margaret Colby, wife of a struggling wheat farmer, childless after 8 years of marriage and countless prayers. Now she was simply a burden, another mouth to feed in a town that barely had enough to sustain itself after the harsh winter that had claimed so many lives, including her beloved Thomas. The debt collectors had been merciless. When Thomas died of pneumonia, they came knocking within a week, demanding payment for the seed money he had borrowed, the equipment he had purchased on credit, the doctor's fees from his final illness. Margaret had sold everything she could, the furniture that had belonged to her mother, her wedding dress, even Thomas's pocket watch that had been his father's. But it wasn't enough. It was never enough. $60, called out a voice from the crowd. Margaret recognized old Pete Morrison, a rancher known for working his help harder than his cattle. Her stomach clenched at the thought of spending her days scrubbing floors and cooking meals for his rough cowboys, knowing full well that her duties might extend far beyond what any decent woman should be asked to endure. 75, came another voice, this one belonging to Samuel Hutchins, the town's undertaker. Margaret had heard whispers about his previous housekeeper, a young widow who had lasted only 3 months before disappearing one night, leaving behind nothing but rumors and speculation. The bidding continued, each number feeling like another nail in the coffin of her dignity. Margaret kept her eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the crowd, trying to pretend she was anywhere but here, that this nightmare would end, and she would wake up in her own bed with Thomas sleeping beside her. But the harsh reality pressed in from all sides, the smell of unwashed bodies and tobacco, the sound of coins jingling in eager hands, the weight of her future being decided by strangers who saw her as nothing more than a commodity. $150. The voice was quiet, but carried across the square with unmistakable authority. Margaret's eyes snapped to the source, and she saw him for the first time, a tall man standing at the edge of the crowd. He wore a clean brown hat and a coat that had seen better days, but was well maintained. His face was weathered by sun and wind, with lines around his eyes that spoke of long hours spent outdoors, but there was something gentle in his expression that set him apart from the other bidders. The auctioneer seemed surprised by the significant jump in price. We have $150 from Mr. Callahan. Do I hear $160? Old Pete Morrison shook his head and spat into the dust. Samuel Hutchins frowned and stepped back into the crowd. The other bidders seemed to understand that this newcomer was serious about his offer, and one by one, they lost interest in the proceedings. $150 going once, going twice, sold to Mr. Jake Callahan. Margaret felt her knees go weak as the gavel came down with a sharp crack that seemed to echo in her chest. She had been sold, just like a horse or a plow or a sack of grain. The crowd began to disperse, their entertainment concluded, leaving her standing alone on the platform with nowhere to go but toward the man who now owned her contract of indenture. Jake Callahan approached the platform with measured steps, his hat in his hands. Up close, Margaret could see that he was younger than she had first thought, probably no more than 35, with brown hair that curled slightly at the edges and eyes the color of creek water after rain. There was something in his expression that she couldn't quite read, not pity exactly, but a kind of understanding that made her feel slightly less like livestock. "Ma'am," he said quietly, nodding toward her with the respect one would show a lady rather than purchased property. "I'm Jake Callahan. I run the Double C Ranch about 10 miles west of town. If you're ready, we can head out there now." Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. She had expected harsh words, immediate demands, perhaps even rough handling from her new owner. Instead, Jake Callahan helped her down from the platform with a gentle hand on her elbow and led her toward a well-maintained wagon hitched to two sturdy horses. The ride to the Double C Ranch was conducted mostly in silence, the only sounds the creaking of the wagon wheels and the steady clop of the horses' hooves on the dirt road. Margaret stole glances at her new employer, trying to gauge what kind of man he might be. His hands on the reins were calloused but clean, and he sat with the easy confidence of someone comfortable in his own skin. When he caught her looking, he didn't leer or make crude comments as she had feared he might. Instead, he simply nodded and turned his attention back to the road ahead. "I should tell you something," Jake said finally, his voice barely audible over the sound of the wind through the prairie grass. "About why I bid on your contract today." Margaret's heart began to race. Here it comes, she thought. The explanation of what would be expected of her, the demands that would be made, the price of her survival in this harsh new world. "I have a daughter," Jake continued, and Margaret felt her breath catch in her throat. "Her name is Lucy, and she's 7 years old. Her mother died when she was just a baby, and I've been raising her on my own ever since. She needs a woman's influence in her life, someone to teach her the things a father can't. That's why I need your help." The confession hung in the air between them like morning mist, unexpected and strangely touching. Margaret had assumed she would be nothing more than a servant, cooking and cleaning for rough cowboys, and enduring whatever else might be demanded of her. The idea that she might actually be needed, that she might serve a purpose beyond mere survival, stirred something in her chest that she had thought died with Thomas. "I should be honest with you too," Margaret said softly. "I was married for 8 years, and we were never blessed with children. I don't know if I'll be any good at mothering." Jake was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was gentle. "I don't think it's something you learn from a book, ma'am. I think it comes from the heart." The Double C Ranch appeared before them as they crested a small hill, and Margaret felt her breath catch at the sight. It wasn't the largest spread she had ever seen, but it was well maintained and prosperous looking, with a sturdy 2-story house surrounded by outbuildings and corrals. Cattle grazed in the distance, dark shapes against the golden prairie grass, and she could see several cowboys working near the barn. But what drew her attention most was the small figure sitting on the front porch steps, a little girl with dark braids and a blue dress that had been carefully mended in several places. As the wagon approached, the child stood and ran toward them, her face lighting up with joy at the sight of her father. Papa, you're back!" Lucy Callahan threw herself into Jake's arms as he climbed down from the wagon, and Margaret watched the transformation that came over this quiet, serious man as he hugged his daughter. His entire face softened, and when he smiled, it changed everything about him, making him appear younger and somehow more approachable. "I missed you too, little bird," Jake said, using what was obviously a pet name that made Lucy giggle. "I want you to meet someone very special. This is Mrs. Colby, and she's going to be staying with us for a while." Lucy turned her attention to Margaret with the direct gaze that only children possess, studying her with frank curiosity. Margaret climbed down from the wagon feeling suddenly self-conscious about her worn dress and the way her hair had escaped its pins during the long ride. She had no experience with children beyond brief encounters in church, and she found herself uncertain of what to say or do. "Are you going to be my new mama?" Lucy asked with the blunt honesty of childhood, and Margaret felt her cheeks flame with embarrassment. "Lucy," Jake said gently, "Mrs. Colby is here to help take care of you and teach you things that I can't. She's not replacing your mama, but she's going to be very important to our family." The word family hit Margaret like a physical blow. She had given up hope of ever being part of a family again when Thomas died, had resigned herself to a life of servitude and loneliness. But standing here in the golden afternoon light, watching this father and daughter who so clearly adored each other, she felt something stir in her chest that she had thought was dead forever. The house was larger inside than it had appeared from the outside, with a comfortable parlor and a kitchen that was clearly the heart of the home. Everything was clean but obviously lacked a woman's touch, the practical arrangements of a man doing his best to create a home for his daughter. Lucy chattered constantly as she showed Margaret around, pointing out her favorite hiding spots in the corner where she kept her collection of interesting rocks. "This is your room," Jake said, opening a door on the second floor to reveal a simple but comfortable space with a bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out over the prairie. "It was my wife's sewing room, but I thought you might like the view." Margaret stepped into the room and felt something settle in her chest. It wasn't large or fancy, but it was hers, a place where she could close the door and be alone with her thoughts. After months of sleeping in the back room of her neighbor's house, grateful for any shelter at all, having her own space felt like an incredible luxury. That first evening, Margaret helped prepare supper, while Lucy sat at the kitchen table doing her lessons. The little girl was bright and eager to please, but Margaret could see the gaps in her education that came from not having a mother's daily influence. Her stitches were uneven, her table manners were serviceable but unrefined, and she had clearly been allowed to run somewhat wild despite her father's best efforts. "Mrs. Colby," Lucy said as they sat down to eat, "Papa says you used to be married too. Where is your husband now?" The question was innocent enough, but it hit Margaret like a punch to the stomach. She saw Jake's warning look at his daughter and understood that he was trying to protect her from having to relive painful memories. "My husband died, sweetheart," Margaret said quietly. "He got very sick, and the sickness took him away." Lucy considered this with the serious expression of a child, trying to understand the incomprehensible adult world. "That's what happened to my mama too," she said finally. "Papa says she watches over me from heaven, and that she loved me very much even though I can't remember her." Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes as she watched Jake reach over to squeeze his daughter's hand. The love between them was so evident, so pure, that it made her chest ache with longing for something she had never had and thought she never would. The weeks that followed fell into a comfortable routine. Margaret rose early to prepare breakfast and pack lunches for Jake and the cowboys who worked the ranch. She spent her mornings teaching Lucy the domestic skills that would be essential for her future, showing her how to mend clothes properly, how to plan and prepare meals, how to manage a household with efficiency and grace. In the afternoons, they worked on Lucy's reading and arithmetic, subjects in which the little girl showed remarkable aptitude when given proper attention and encouragement. But it was the evenings that Margaret treasured most, when the three of them would sit in the parlor after supper. Jake would work on ranch accounts while Lucy practiced her needlework, and Margaret would read aloud from whatever books they could find. Lucy was particularly fond of adventure stories, and she would listen with rapt attention as Margaret brought the characters to life with different voices and dramatic flourishes. "You're good at that," Jake said one evening after Lucy had been tucked into bed. "At making stories come alive. She's never shown such interest in books before." Margaret felt a warm glow of pride at the compliment. She's a bright child. She just needed someone to take the time with her. They were sitting by the fire, Margaret mending one of Lucy's dresses while Jake cleaned his rifle, a domestic scene that felt both natural and strange to her. She had shared similar evenings with Thomas, but they had been quiet affairs, comfortable but lacking the sense of purpose she felt here. With Thomas, she had always felt like she was failing at her most important job, as a wife, by not giving him children. Here, she felt useful, needed, important in a way she had never experienced before. "Margaret," Jake said quietly, and she realized it was the first time he had used her given name. "I want you to know that what happened in town, the way you came to be here, it doesn't define your place in this house. You're not a servant or an employee. You're part of this family if you want to be." The words hit her like a thunderbolt, and she nearly dropped her sewing. She looked up to find Jake watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something warmer than friendship but not quite the look of a man courting a woman. "I don't know what to say," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling of the fire. "You don't have to say anything tonight," Jake replied. "Just know that it's true. Lucy adores you, and I can see how much you care for her. That's worth more to me than all the cattle on this ranch." Winter came early that year, with fierce storms that kept everyone close to the house for days at a time. Margaret found herself growing closer to both Jake and Lucy during those long, quiet evenings by the fire. She learned that Jake had come to Texas from Missouri after the war, seeking a fresh start after losing his parents and his childhood home. His wife, Lucy's mother, had been the daughter of a neighboring rancher, and their marriage had been brief but apparently very happy. She was so young, Jake said one evening when Lucy had fallen asleep in Margaret's lap while listening to a story. Only 19 when Lucy was born, 20 when she died. "Sometimes I wonder if I robbed her of her girlhood by marrying her so quickly." Margaret looked down at Lucy's peaceful face, This beautiful child who had become so precious to her in such a short time. I think she would be very proud of the daughter you've raised, she said softly. Lucy is kind and bright and full of love. That doesn't happen by accident. Jake was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was rough with emotion. I was so angry when she died. At the world, at myself for not being able to save her. I didn't know how I was going to raise a daughter on my own. Some days I still don't. You're not on your own anymore, Margaret said before she could stop herself, and then felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment at her boldness. But Jake didn't seem offended by her presumption. Instead, he smiled, the first truly unguarded smile she had seen from him since that first day with Lucy on the porch. No, he said quietly. I guess I'm not. Spring came with a rush of new life that seemed to awaken something in Margaret's heart. She watched Lucy run through the meadows behind the house, chasing butterflies and picking wildflowers, and felt a fierce protectiveness that surprised her with its intensity. This child had become hers in every way that mattered, not through blood or birth, but through love and daily devotion. Mama Margaret, Lucy said one afternoon as they worked in the garden together, planting vegetables for the summer harvest. Will you teach me to make that cake you made for Papa's birthday? The one with the berries. Margaret's hands stilled on the seedling she was planting. Lucy had been calling her Mama Margaret for weeks now, but it never failed to make her heart skip a beat. She had never corrected the child because it felt too precious, this gift of motherhood she had never thought she would receive. Of course, sweetheart, Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion. We'll make it together. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold, Jake brought up something that had been weighing on his mind. I've been thinking about Lucy's future, he said, his voice careful and measured. She's getting to the age where she needs more formal schooling than what we can provide here. There's talk of hiring a real teacher for the town school, someone with proper training. Margaret felt her heart sink. She had been dreading this conversation, knowing it would come eventually, but hoping she could postpone it indefinitely. Lucy was bright and deserved every opportunity for education and advancement. But the thought of sending her away, even just to town each day, made Margaret feel physically ill. She could board with the preacher's family during the week. Jake continued. Come home on weekends. It would be best for her in the long run. No. The word burst out of Margaret with such force that both Jake and Lucy turned to stare at her. I mean, surely we can find another way. She's still so young, and there are things I can teach her here that no school can provide. Jake studied her face for a long moment, and Margaret realized that her desperate reaction had revealed more about her feelings than she had intended. She loved this child with a fierceness that terrified her, and the thought of losing even a part of her daily presence was unbearable. What if we brought the teacher here? Jake said thoughtfully. Built a small schoolhouse on the property, invited some of the other ranch families to send their children. Lucy could get her education without leaving home. Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes at this unexpected solution. It would cost Jake money he might not have, require efforts and arrangements that would benefit him very little directly. He was proposing it for her sake, because he understood how much Lucy meant to her. You would do that, she whispered. I would do anything to keep this family together, Jake replied, and something in his tone made Margaret's heart begin to race. The summer that followed was the happiest period of Margaret's life. The small schoolhouse was built, and a young teacher named Miss Sarah Andrews came to live in town and teach the ranch children. Lucy thrived under the more formal instruction, but came home each day full of stories and excitement, sharing her lessons with Margaret over supper. Margaret found herself settling into the role of ranch wife and mother with a naturalness that surprised everyone, including herself. She organized the household with quiet efficiency, managed the relationships with neighboring families, and even learned to help with the ranch accounts when needed. The cowboys who worked for Jake treated her with genuine respect, and she began to understand that her position in this household was far more secure than her original contract had implied. It was during a fierce thunderstorm in late July that everything changed between Margaret and Jake. Lucy had been frightened by the lightning and had come to sleep in Margaret's room, curled up beside her like a kitten seeking comfort. Margaret was dozing when she heard Jake's voice calling her name from downstairs. She found him in the kitchen, his shirt soaked with rain and his face grim with worry. One of the cowboys was struck by lightning, he said tersely. Charlie's riding for the doctor, but I need to get back out there. Can you come help? I know it's a lot to ask, but I don't have anyone else. Margaret didn't hesitate. She grabbed her shawl and followed Jake out into the storm, leaving Lucy safe in her bed with strict instructions not to leave the house. The injured cowboy was unconscious and badly burned, and Margaret found herself drawing on reserves of strength and knowledge she didn't know she possessed. She cleaned his wounds, helped Jake move him to a more sheltered location, and stayed with him through the long night until the doctor arrived. When morning came, and they were finally able to return to the house, Margaret was exhausted and covered in mud and blood, but she felt more alive than she had in years. She had been needed in a crisis, had proven herself capable of more than domestic duties, had shown that she truly belonged on this ranch. I don't know how to thank you, Jake said as they stood together on the porch, watching the sun rise over the rain-washed prairie. What you did tonight, the way you jumped in to help without hesitation, it means everything to me. Margaret looked at this man who had given her back her life, who had shown her a kind of love and family she had never imagined possible, and realized that something fundamental had shifted in her heart during those long hours in the storm. Jake, she said quietly, I need to tell you something. He turned to face her, and she saw her own feelings reflected in his eyes, the awareness that they had moved beyond the boundaries of their original arrangement into something deeper and more complex. I love her, Margaret said simply. I love Lucy as if she were my own daughter, born of my body and my heart. And I love this life, this ranch, this family we've built together. I don't ever want to leave. Jake stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, could smell the scent of rain and leather that clung to his clothes. Margaret, he said softly, what if I told you that you never had to leave? What if I asked you to stay not as an employee or a housekeeper, but as my wife, as Lucy's mother in truth as well as in love? The proposal hung in the air between them like morning mist, beautiful and fragile and full of possibility. Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes as she realized that this man was offering her everything she had ever wanted and never dared to hope for. Yes, she whispered, the word barely audible but carrying the weight of her entire future. Yes, Jake. Yes to all of it. When they told Lucy the news over breakfast, the little girl's reaction was everything Margaret could have hoped for. She threw her arms around both of them with a joy so pure and complete that it brought tears to everyone's eyes. Does this mean you'll really be my mama forever? Lucy asked, her small hands gripping Margaret's dress as if afraid she might disappear. Forever and always. Margaret promised, her voice thick with emotion. Nothing will ever change that. The wedding was held on a crisp October day, exactly 1 year after Margaret had stood on that auction platform in Cedar Ridge. The ceremony was simple, attended by neighbors and ranch hands, but it was filled with more love and joy than many grand affairs. Lucy stood beside Margaret as her maid of honor, clutching a bouquet of wildflowers and beaming with pride. As Margaret spoke her vows to Jake, promising to love and honor him for the rest of her days, she thought about the strange path that had brought her to this moment. She had been sold like property, had come to this ranch expecting servitude and finding instead a love greater than anything she had ever imagined possible. I take you not just as my husband, she added to her traditional vows, but as the father of the daughter who has become my heart, and I promise to love you both with everything I have for all the days of my life. Jakey's own vows were simple but heartfelt. Margaret, you came to us when we needed you most, but I think maybe we needed each other. You've made us a family in the truest sense of the word, and I promise to spend the rest of my life making sure you know how precious you are to us. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the stars come out over the prairie, Lucy curled up between them with a book in her lap, Margaret reflected on the miracle of her life. She had been a barren wife, a destitute widow, a woman sold to pay debts not of her making. But she had also become something she had never expected, a mother in the deepest sense of the word, not through blood but through choice and love and daily devotion. Mama, Lucy said sleepily, tell me the story about the princess who found her family. Margaret smiled and began to weave a tale about a lonely princess who traveled far from home and discovered that sometimes the greatest treasures are found in the most unexpected places. As she spoke, she felt Jake's hand slip into hers, warm and collused and infinitely reassuring. The wind whispered through the prairie grass, carrying with it the scent of wildflowers and the promise of tomorrow. Somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed softly, and Margaret could hear the gentle sounds of the ranch settling in for the night. This was her world now, this family she had been given against all odds, this love that had found her when she had lost all hope. She had been sold at auction like livestock, but she had found her way to a different kind of freedom, one measured not in dollars or contracts but in morning kisses from a sleepy 7-year-old, in quiet conversations by firelight, in the knowledge that she was loved and needed and valued beyond measure. As the stars wheeled overhead in their eternal dance, Margaret Callahan held her family close and knew that she was finally, truly home. The woman who had thought she could never be a mother had become one in the most perfect way possible, not through the accident of birth, but through the deliberate choice of love. And in loving Lucy and Jake, in being loved by them in return, she had discovered that some families are not born but made, forged in the fires of hardship and sealed with promises that last forever. The prairie wind sang its ancient song of endurance and hope, and Margaret listened with a heart full of gratitude for the unexpected paths that had led her to this moment, this place, this perfect, improbable family that had become her entire world.